Welcome back. Hope you made it through that last section okay. Remember, I warned you it was a deep dive with a lot of new terminology. Can't tell you this chapter is going to be easier, but remember, we're building a foundation. Bricks aren't interesting, but they're important. So let's keep going. Today we're going to talk about ownership. Ownership of land. This is where it gets fun, right? What do I actually own? It's mine. We like ownership. There's different reasons that different people want to own property. So again, remember I told you got to think outside of the box, because whenever most people think about ownership of property, we want an exclusive right to it. We don't want anybody else to interfere with it. We just want to own property. If I want to own property all by myself and I'm the only owner, they actually call that sole ownership, and you're going to learn about that in our chapter. Sole ownership, or ownership in severalty. Several, kind of a contradiction in terms, but ownership in severalty. I know this is a horrible illustration. It won't be the only one I give you, so don't hold it against me. But ownership in severalty, whenever you say severalty or severed in our terminology, think back to the old days where they just lob off your head. It's severed. Severalty, because there's lots of things we're going to talk about several or severalty as a contradiction term, but you need to remember that's ownership or a concept lobbed off from everybody else. Horrible illustration, I know, forgive me for it, but you're going to be taking your state exam, you're going to see severalty, you're going to see a head rolling in your eyes, and sorry, but you'll get a question right and you'll thank me then. You might hate me now, but you'll thank me then, so I'll take it. Ownership and severalty, or sole ownership, is ownership, interest, and rights cut off from everybody else's ownership. Now remember though, we're talking about ownership in this chapter. I could have sole ownership, but would other people still have rights possibly to my property? Yeah, like the government can dictate some of the rights. We'll get into more of those things later, but even sole ownership or ownership in severalty doesn't mean that no outside influences can affect my use of the property, but it does mean that one person by themselves away from everybody else owns it. Because remember, we're always making differentiation between ownership and usage or access rights. So this chapter we're going to talk about ownership. So tenancy and severalty, you'll see ownership as ownership, tenancy, another contradiction in terms, because usually whenever we see tenant, we think a renter. But tenancy actually as a term refers to your interest and right. So tenancy and severalty is ownership by one person. Bigger and bigger vocabulary words. The next concept we're going to talk about is co-ownership. So maybe I'm going into this ownership of property. I don't want my interest lobbed off from everybody else. I want to own this property with someone else. And there's several different reasons for that. My husband and I own properties together. I didn't want my interest to be separate from him. I wanted him to be a partner in the properties with me. So depending on what you're doing, you could want sole ownership, or you would want to share those interests with someone else. My husband and I, and most of the co-ownerships you're going to talk about, are what they called an undivided interest in the whole property. Undivided interest in the whole property. But if we're 50-50 owners, wouldn't he own 50% and I own 50%? Yeah, but that's an ownership percentage of the interest in the property, not the property itself. Remember, ownership rights or ownership responsibilities and rights of use, two completely different things. So our ownership could be a 50-50 interest split, but our use of the property is an undivided interest in the whole. In other words, if we sell it, we would probably have to split it 50-50. But on a daily basis, I can't draw a line down the middle and tell him he's got to stay on his side. Does that make sense? So we own the property as a percentage split, and you're going to talk about different ways to make that split in the chapter. But our use is an undivided interest in the whole. So when that terminology comes up, that's what it's talking about, that all co-owners would have an undivided use in the entire property, but they could have individual shares of ownership. So co-ownership is any time the property is owned by more than one owner. You're also going to hear in your chapter that property can be owned by ownership or an entity. We're not talking about aliens and stuff, but ownership by an individual or an entity. What type of entity? How would an entity own a property? What about a corporation? Isn't a corporation or a company, an LLC, a general partnership, couldn't that be an entity? Yes, it's like a little baby created whenever you make a corporation, and that corporation itself can also own properties. I could have 50 people that go in together to start a corporation. How many owners would that property have whenever it buys a property? Another trick question. Don't say 50, it would have one owner. Remember, 50 owners, one corporation, that corporation becomes a new entity. So again, basis building so that it helps make more sense later, but basics, ownership and severalty or sole ownership is by one owner. Co-ownership is whenever there's multiple owners that own the property. First two concepts you're going to hear about are tenancy in common and joint tenancy. Really important bullet points to remember about each. And people say, well, I don't understand why these concepts are important. They're very important. And in everyday real estate, it's important to know whenever you go into these transactions, these types of ownerships have to be set up from the beginning. So let's go back to my husband and I owning property. If anything ever happens to either of us, we wanted to make sure, and we talked about fee simple, with a fee estate, I own so much interest I could even leave it to an heir. I wanted to make sure that if anything happened to me, he would be protected. He would still have the problem, or still have the property, not have to deal with the problem of maybe my children saying, no, I want my mom's half. So our properties are owned as joint tenants with the right of survivorship. You're going to learn about that type of interest today, or that type of ownership today. So we are joint tenants with right of survivorship. Survivor, like Survivor Island. The last person standing gets everything. We don't have to go to probate court for it. We don't have to fight the kids over it. If one of us passes away, the other person automatically owns the whole property. So joint tenancy with the right of survivorship is ownership by more than one person. The last person standing automatically gets ownership of the whole property, but it's still that undivided interest in the whole. Now, tenants in common. What if I'm going into a property, maybe my husband and I have different things that we want to have happen after both of us pass away. Maybe he wants his interest to go to certain people. I want my interest to go to certain people. I don't want him to absorb it if anything happened to me, or have certain rights to sell that property without me. Then maybe we would enter that property ownership as tenants in common. Biggest defining characteristic of tenancy in common is you don't have that right of survivorship. It's not the last person standing gets the property. The ownership interest passed to the heirs, or whoever that person would dictate in the will. So imagine you and two partners buy a property, something were to happen to one of them, now the remaining two partners own that property with all of that other partner's children. So remember, tenants in common, last person standing joint tenancy, last person standing gets it. Tenants in common, you can have individual shares, and the one defining characteristic is that you can leave your remaining property to heirs, not automatically absorbed by the remaining parties. Now remember, we said there's national content and there's state-specific content. This next type of ownership, tenancy by the entireties. When you read the material, you'll say, well, that sounds a lot like joint tenancy. It does. It sounds a whole lot like joint tenancy. But there are some states that have common law rules. Common law rules are common law customs where if you're married, you automatically own part of your spouse's property. You don't even have to be on title. The law just says, statutory law says, that you automatically have an ownership interest in any property just because you're married to somebody. So you'll learn about tenancy by the entireties, but remember, if you don't live in a common law state, those rules wouldn't apply in your state. Like in my state, Georgia, there's no tenancy by the entireties in Georgia because we're not a common law state. So tenancy by the entireties is a concept, and it could be a potential concept of ownership. You definitely need to be aware of it, but remember, it may or may not apply directly to your state. Community property is another concept that would be in a common law state, that when you own property owned by spouses in that common law state, who has an ownership interest in it and who doesn't. All right, so let's move on to trust. let's move on to trust. We talked a little bit about people passing away. We don't ever like to think about that. But one of the reasons for different types of ownership is to know how that property is going to be dispersed later on. Can my co-owner sell it without my permission? If I get sued by somebody, can they take my property? So there's different reasons and different legal background behind each type. But sometimes what's going to happen later is the forethought to know what type of ownership you're going to have. And that's where we get into trust. A trust is, again, a separate entity set aside for the disbursement of property. My husband has a son with special needs. So there's a special needs trust that can be set aside where you put money into it and it's only set aside for that person. Once the money goes there, it's not my husband's money, it's not his son's money, it's not his mother's money, it's a completely separate entity set aside to be a trust. We can trust you to take care of this property on someone else's behalf. So when you get into trust, it's another complicated concept, but hopefully that will help make some sense. Set aside for the protection of someone. And the last couple things you're going to hear about, condominiums and cooperatives. A lot of people see condominium and you automatically think anything that touches each other on some side is a condo, but that's not the case either. Remember, we're talking about legal forms of ownership. So when you get into condominiums, don't think in your head a visual picture of what you think a condominium is going to look like. It is a legal concept of ownership where you just own the airspace within the walls, basically, and then the condominium association owns everything else. So a condominium could be a residence, a condominium could be a parking garage space, a condominium could be your unit for your office complex. So don't look at just the visual that you think a condo is. Remember, these are legal aspects and different forms of ownership. Same with a co-op. Make sure that you're learning those bullet points. And then the last thing is timeshares. Remember, we talked about this chapter is all about legal concepts of ownership. Two different types of timeshare concept. One is a right to use, the other is a right to own. People always ask this question, so I'll go ahead and throw it out there. Yes, you can own a property for just 1 week out of the year. A timeshare right to own concept. Or you could own the right to use that property for just 1 week out of the year. Remember, the basis of real estate is what rights do we have, what interests, do we own them, or do we have permissions and rights of use? So keep all that in your head as you make all of this come clear, and remember, it's going to all start rolling together. So enjoy this chapter as you dig a little bit deeper into different possibilities for how you can own and use property.